Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory forever.
After a long pause in our retreats here at St. John Chrysostom Parish in Houston, Texas, we're once again continuing our series of retreats on the saints, popularly known as the Cloud of Witnesses. Today's presentation is on Saint Seraphim of Sarov. This series takes its name from the letter to the Hebrews. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us rid ourselves of every burden and sin that clings to us and persevere in running the race that lies before us. The cloud of witnesses are the saints, and having already run the race, the saints serve as witnesses and examples of faith, of perseverance, and of strength. And this series of retreats examines the lives of the saints, and it enables us to become more aware of our communion with them. Because holiness is attractive, the lives of the saints beckon us to God. These holy men and women who have gone before us inspire us to emulate their faith and to call upon them in our time of need. We rely on the intercession of the saints to help us run the race that lies before us. In our Byzantine temple, we are literally surrounded by icons of various angels and saints who are made present through their iconographic depictions. If someone were to walk in here and he had no background at all of our faith, maybe someone who had no faith at all, had never been exposed to anything like this, might come in here and have the impression, as he looks at the saints, looks at the icons, he might say, these people must be important to them because they're painted and they're hanging on all the walls. The whole church here is surrounded by these people. These must be important people to this group that gathers here in this church. Today, we look at the life, the witness, and the mission of Saint Seraphim of Sarov, whose eyes of the heart were so purified that he spiritually beheld the light of Christ, the glory of the light of Christ, and after a lifetime of asceticism and theosis, he was transfigured and he actually radiated the uncreated light of Christ. The overriding theme of Saint Seraphim's life was the light and the fire of the Holy Spirit. Saint Seraphim is a very inspiring figure. He shows us that a soul rooted and grounded in love can comprehend with all the holy ones the height and depth of the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge. Saint Seraphim has become a universally beloved saint. His appeal transcends ritual and ecclesial boundaries. Although he is most beloved in the Russian and Greek churches and to us in the Eastern Catholic Church, in recent years, he has become known and loved in the West as well. St. John Paul II wrote a book called Crossing the Threshold of Hope. And in that book, he mentions several Western saints. He mentions one Eastern saint, and it's Saint Seraphim of Sarov. And he lauds Saint Seraphim in his book, Crossing the Threshold of Hope. He lauds him as a saint who achieved the fullness of mystical prayer. Some people have made a comparison between Saint Seraphim and Saint Francis of Assisi, who is also a very beloved saint and who also has a universal appeal. As we learn about the life of Saint Seraphim, we may see some similarities to the life of Saint Francis of Assisi. Now, before we begin, I have to issue a caveat. The scope of Saint Seraphim's life, his mission, and his spiritual teachings are greater than we can cover in this mini retreat today. So if you want to know more about Saint Seraphim as a result of this retreat, There are a number of books that I can show you or recommend to you, or you may already even have been familiar with. You may already be reading about his life and his teachings. There are a number of sources that you can consult to read about his spiritual teachings. The best that we can do in this retreat today is just to present some of the highlights of his life and the spirituality and theology found in it. Sometimes Catholics want to know, especially Catholics of a Western tradition, sometimes they'll wonder, is it okay to venerate an Orthodox saint? The short answer is yes, it's acceptable. But we can go a little bit further than that. In 2016, let me just back up. Private devotion is acceptable. In 2016, a representative of Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow conveyed a relic of Saint Seraphim of Sarov to Pope Francis, who venerated the relic, and he has it in his possession. So there have been many instances between the Catholic and Orthodox churches of sharing and venerating relics, which witnesses to us that the lives of the saints transcend the man-made separation of the churches. One more thing to note, especially for Roman Catholics, Latin Catholics, who may be new to venerating an Orthodox saint, so to speak. In 1969, Pope Pius XII permitted 21 post-schism saints to be venerated, and they were placed on the general Roman calendar of 1969. And I have a list, if anybody's interested in that, of these 21 saints from the East that were permitted for veneration. So to sum all this up, we're on very safe ground, examining the life of Saint Seraphim of Sarov, who comes from the Russian Orthodox tradition. And we're going to find in his life a life of virtue and holiness that it's an appeal to all of us. And like I said, he has gained, is gaining, it seems, a universal appeal, much like St. Francis of Assisi has a universal appeal. Now, in the publicity for this retreat, there was a flyer, and underneath St. Seraphim of Sarov, there were 3 titles: Hesychast, Staudets, and Wonder Worker. These 3 titles capture what St. Seraphim was all about. A hesychast is someone who practices hesychasm, which is an ascetical spirituality of contemplation and unceasing prayer, particularly the Jesus prayer. We're going to talk quite a bit about the spirituality and theology of hesychasm towards the end of the retreat. So he was a hesychast. He was a staudets, which is a Russian name, Russian term. It basically means a spiritual elder, a spiritual guide, a spiritual advisor. The classic characteristic of a staudets is insight or foresight, the ability to read hearts, the ability to offer a remedy to people's problems. A staudets is like a spiritual physician, and would that we all had one in our lives, accessible to us, because we all need that. And then finally, St. Seraphim is given the title Wonder Worker, which is like his official title, St. Seraphim of Sarov, Wonder Worker. A wonder worker is a particular classification of saint known for the miracles that God works through him or her. The life of Saint Seraphim of Sarov begins and ends with the presence of the Holy Theotokos, the Mother of God, depicted in iconography. I placed 2 icons here on the tetrapod, and these 2 icons serve as bookends to Saint Seraphim's life. Before we get into the biography, the story of his life, we have to go back 500 years from his birth and learn about the story of this icon, which will play a significant role in Saint Seraphim's life, and which continues to play a significant role in the world today, as we're about to find out. This particular icon is called the wonder-working Kursk root icon of the Mother of God. And this icon made a miraculous appearance in the city of Kursk, Russia, on the feast of the Nativity of the Mother of God, September 8th, 1259. It's very providential that we're offering this retreat today because tomorrow is the leave-taking of the feast of the Nativity of the Mother of God. So we are in the week, this festive week of this particular feast of the Nativity of the Mother of God. This is one of the most ancient icons of the Russian Church. The foundation for this iconographic type is Our Lady of the Sign, and it comes from the words of the prophet Isaiah. Therefore, the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Byzantine churches have this, at least the center area of this icon, have that icon in the apse of the church. It's called Our Lady of the Sign. It's also called More Spacious Than the Heavens. The Mother of God has her hands outstretched in prayer, and Jesus is in her womb. So in the city of Kursk in 1259, a hunter was hunting in the forest from his nearby city, and he noticed something lying face down like this near the root of a tree. And when he went to examine it and pick it up and turn it over, what he found was the icon of the Mother of God of the Sign. So what he would have seen was just this original center section. This was the original icon, was this part. So he found this icon on September 8th, 1259. When he picked it up, a spring gushed forth from the spot where the icon was found. And it had healing properties, became a source of healing, the spring. And the hunter then built a small chapel for the icon. Now, the prince of the nearby city, Rilsk, demanded that it be brought to his city. But because of his pride and a lack of faith, when the icon came to Rilsk, he did not go out to meet the icon and venerate it, and so he was punished with blindness. It got his attention because he repented, and then he promised to build a church in Rilsk, which he did. But every time the icon was left in the church in Rilsk, it was miraculously transported back to the small chapel in the woods of Kursk. A holy priest then made it his mission to pray in this wilderness chapel and to keep watch over the icon. The enemies of God appeared. They set fire to the chapel. They took the icon and they split it in half, because that's what enemies of God do, evil things. They threw one half of the icon in the bushes, and they threw the other half of the icon somewhere deeper in the forest. They took the priest as a prisoner. Eventually, the priest was ransomed and released, and he went in search of the icon. And he found the half of the icon nearby, and he found the other half of the icon way deep into the forest, about a mile into the forest. Miraculously, when he put the two pieces of the icon back together, the wood grew back together, and it left only a seam in the icon. It's miraculous. Hundreds of years later, in the 16th century, Tsar Theodore brought that icon to Moscow, and he had it placed in a silver gilt frame, which would be all of this now around the icon. And included in that frame were 9 Old Testament prophets who wrote about the birth of Christ. So added now to the original icon of Our Lady of the Sign are the 9 prophets from the Old Testament: King Solomon, Daniel, Jeremiah, Elijah, Habakkuk, Gideon, Isaiah, Moses, and King David. In 1898, revolutionaries placed a bomb in the Cathedral of the Sign in Kursk, and they had planned it to go off while the monks were praying Vespers. There was an explosion. The monks were unharmed. The icon miraculously was preserved. In 1959, Russian refugees and their ecclesiastical synod moved to North America, and the icon was placed in the cathedral of the icon of Our Lady of the Sign in New York City, which is under the jurisdiction of Rokor, the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia. In 2009, the icon was taken to Kursk the first time since 1918. It went back to its home in Kursk. And since 2009, the icon makes yearly visits from New York City to Russia. Last year, May 13th, 2020, the Russian Orthodox Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, Bishop Nicholas of Manhattan, took the icon on an airplane, and the airplane made an aerial procession around the New York metropolitan area, which he blessed with the Kursk root icon. And if you don't believe me, I have a picture of the good bishop with the icon on his lap in an airplane blessing the New York metropolitan area. I have also included on this sheet some Russian cosmonauts in their spaceship adorned with icons. And I put that there because I wanted to say, you gotta love the Russians and their icons. Now, let's find out how this particular icon played a very significant role in the life of Saint Seraphim. Seraphim was born Prokhor Moshnin in Kursk, Russia in 1759, 500 years after the miraculous discovery of this icon. He was named after one of the 7 deacons in the Acts of the Apostles, Prokhor, who was a disciple of St. John the theologian. His father was Isidore, his mother was Agathia, and those are 2 names that will become very important for us to remember, Isidore and Agathia. His father was a building contractor, and he built churches, amongst other things. In the process of building a church dedicated to St. Sergius of Radunej, another very beloved saint in the Russian church, his father died. Little Prokhor was only 3 years old, and his mother Agathia then raised little Prokhor and his brother and sister. Agathia was a pious and valiant woman. She even took over the supervision of her husband's workshops and supervised the building of that particular church. From his mother, little Prokhor inherited her kind and sensitive heart, and her spiritual influence would last for the rest of his life. So we see in Agathia the powerful influence of a pious, praying mother. As a child, little Prokhor attended church services. He prayed. He listened attentively to the lives of the saints. And several events which started to occur early in his life would show us that he was always under a very special protection. When he was 7 years old, Agathia took little Prokhor to the top of the scaffolding around the bell tower of the church that they were building. It was 50 feet up. Little Prokhor stumbled on a piece of wood and he fell to the ground 50 feet. His mother, Agathia, was convinced that he died. How could anyone survive a fall from 50 feet up? She ran down to the ground and she found little Prokhor standing there quietly. A fool for Christ witnessed this event and prophesied, "This child must surely be one of God's elect." A fool for Christ is another classification of saints that we find in the Eastern Church, where a fool for Christ would feign insanity in order to cover up or hide spiritual gifts they might have, or to deflect any tension away from themselves, or to appear repulsive or something. It's a whole classification called fools for Christ. And they would often have the gift of prophecy or foresight like this one did. The second miraculous event in little Prochor's life occurred when he was 10 years old. He became seriously ill, and in a dream, he saw the Mother of God who promised to come to him and heal him. A few days later, there was a procession of this cursed root icon passing through the city of Kursk, and Agathia was very disappointed that little Prochor was too sick and they wouldn't be able to leave their home to venerate the icon or to meet the procession. Well, it started to rain, and so the priest had to shorten the route of the procession, and he detoured the procession right through the Moshnin's garden. And Agathia seized the moment, saw it as a wonderful opportunity. She grabbed little Prochor. She was able to bring him right outside. He was able to venerate the icon, and shortly thereafter, he completely recovered from his illness. As a young man, he was expected to develop a trade, and he went to work in his brother's shop. But Prochor, even at this point, teenage years, he had an aversion to business and to a merchant's life. He was attracted to the spiritual life. He felt most at home in church. That's where he wanted to be. He would gather friends around him. He would teach them about the spiritual wisdom he found in books and studies. But interiorly, he continued to yearn to withdraw from people and meditate. And this desire that he had from a very early age grew stronger, and he spent as much time in solitude and prayer as he could. This conviction stayed with him for the rest of his life. So then he got to a point where he asked Agathia for her blessing to pursue a monastic vocation. She was most supportive. The hour came. All the relatives and friends of the Moshnin family gathered in the home. His mother, Agathia, was sobbing. Prochor bowed before his mother, and he asked her for her blessing to leave for the monastery, which she gave to him. She held an icon of Christ and the Theotokos up for Prochor to venerate. She made the sign of the cross, and she gave him a large copper cross for him to wear. He never took that cross off for the rest of his life. And that's why you'll see in iconography of Saint Seraphim, many times he's depicted with a very large copper cross. That's where it came from, his mother. He entered the monastery in Sarov, and that's where he gets his name, Saint Seraphim of Sarov. He was given mundane tasks in the monastery. He had to clean the cell of his mentor. He would bake the communion bread. He worked in the carpentry shop. But spiritually, he prayed the Jesus prayer. He studied the scriptures. He studied the lives of the saints. But even though he was in a monastery, living a very, we would say, intense spiritual life, he still yearned for complete solitude. In the monastery, once again, he became ill. And after receiving communion one day, he had a vision. The Mother of God was surrounded by an indescribable light, and she was escorted by the apostles Peter and John. She pointed to Prochor, and she said to Peter and John, "He is one of our kind." She put her hand on his head, and within a few days, he was completely healed. At the age of 25, he took monastic vows and received the name Seraphim. And at this point now, we will refer to him as Seraphim. He took this name because the prior saw in him the flaming love of God and the zeal to live according to God's will, because Seraphim means fiery. And we'll see how throughout Seraphim's life, he certainly lived up to his name. He was ordained a deacon, and he had another extraordinary vision during the Divine Liturgy on Holy Thursday. He saw Jesus enter into the church in all his glory, surrounded by angels. Jesus walked above the ground. He raised his hands and he blessed everyone in the church. After this ecstatic vision of Seraphim, he couldn't speak for a couple of hours and he couldn't move. He went on to become ordained a priest. But once again, after the liturgical services, he would retire to a remote cell in the forest praying. So we see how his monastic life follows the pattern of St. Anthony of Egypt, who didn't stay in a monastery but lived in solitude under a spiritual father, and who then became available to a constant stream of visitors. When Seraphim went to the forest and took up his abode there, he had a hut and very primitive, simple accommodations. Now the intense work of spiritual warfare would begin. He was confronted by the enemies of asceticism. These spiritual lions sought to hinder the spiritual efficaciousness of this holy hermit. He was attacked by a large number of evil spirits, which manifested physically and sometimes caused the hut to shake. There are descriptions of what he endured in these spiritual attacks, but I'm going to save us all the creepy details because they are creepy, absolutely horrifying. Like St. Anthony of Egypt and like St. Sergius before him, he too was physically attacked by these spirits, which often took the form of wild beasts. He persisted in his prayers and his fasting, and over he would make the Easter proclamation, "Let God arise and let his enemies be scattered," which caused the attacks to cease. Eventually, he was no longer afraid of these vicious attacks of these beasts, and he was no longer afraid of the vicious animals of the forest, and he developed a peaceful relationship with the animals. In particular, he made a friendship with a bear who was known to gently approach him and eat out of his hand. And he gave the name Misha to the bear, which basically means bear. So he restored harmony with creation through his asceticism, through his spiritual life. This is maybe one example of where we would see a similarity to St. Francis of Assisi. There was a story in the life of St. Francis that there was a wolf who was terrorizing the citizens of Gubbio, and St. Francis tamed the wolf of Gubbio. So there's a real strong similarity between the two of them as far as wild animals go and so forth. And that's why in icons of St. Seraphim of Sarov, he's often depicted with a bear. The enemies of God did not stop their campaign to thwart Seraphim's ascetical life, because the life of a holy ascetic is despised by the evil spirits. So 3 robbers showed up one day at his hut, and they demanded money. And a scuffle ensued, and Seraphim fell to the ground. Seraphim had an axe in his hand, but he did not defend himself with it. They checked the hut for money, but all they could find were a few potatoes and some icons. So if you're ever wondering what's inside of a holy hermit's hermitage, it's a few potatoes and some icons. Seraphim was beaten and he was dragged to his cell. He was tied up and left for dead. The 3 robbers, in the process of this attack, came to their senses. They were horrified and they ran away. Seraphim prayed, he forgave his attackers, and he crawled all the way back to the monastery. His skull was fractured, his ribs were broken, he had wounds all over his body. He fell asleep in the care of the monks who were nursing him, and he had another vision. The Mother of God appeared, and once again, with Peter and John, she pointed to Seraphim and said, "He is one of our kind." He eventually recovered enough to get out of bed. He stayed in the monastery for 5 months, and then he went back to his hut in the forest. The attack left him hunched over and in need of a walking stick for the rest of his life, and that's why a lot of the icons depict him hunched over, leaning on a walking stick. That's where this comes from. In the handout I gave you, you'll even see something that looks like a photograph or a portrait. That portrait was made of Saint Seraphim during his lifetime, and that is what he looked like. And you can see how in his iconography, how the icons depict the real portrait of the person. The robbers came back to visit Seraphim once again, but this time they repented of their deed and they begged Seraphim to plead for them before the police. They did the crime, but they were begging Seraphim to plead their case so they didn't have to do the time. Seraphim decided to take a vow of silence. He closed the door of his hut to all visitors, and for several years he lived this way, only going to the monastery for communion. During this time, he spent 1,000 days and nights kneeling on a stone praying. He could no longer walk to the monastery for liturgies, and so they ordered him to go back to the monastery to live. He had spent 15 years in solitude in the forest. After several years of silence in the monastery, the Mother of God appeared to him again and instructed him to open the door of his cell for all those seeking prayer and advice. Now, what strikes me about this is look at the qualifications Seraphim earned to become a starets, right? He spent years and years and years in ascetical prayer in the forest, in solitude, in unceasing prayer. Spent years living a monastic life in a holy monastery. Spent years in the liturgical services of the church, and so forth. And only after all of that did the Mother of God appear to him and give him the mandate to open his door and become a spiritual father. Only then, so to speak, was he qualified to be a spiritual guide, a starets. He received everyone who came to him. He would kiss the hand of all those who came, and he would greet every person with, "Christ is risen, my joy." And it said that he was visited by more than 2,000 people a day. He devoted himself to receiving suffering humanity, and he was besieged by the throngs of people who came seeking comfort and help. And all classes and conditions came to Saint Seraphim. Vehicles of all kinds. They came in luxurious carriages. They came in peasants' carts. They came on foot. Some people took a vow of a wandering pilgrim, traveling from one holy place to another. Some even slept under the stars. When the throngs of people became overwhelming, at least back when he was still in the forest and he needed to rest and rejuvenate, he had dug a pit behind the stove in his hermitage, and he would hide in the pit from the throngs of people because he had to rest and rejuvenate. What's interesting about this in the life of Saint Seraphim, the life of Saint Anthony of Egypt, and these spiritual fathers, these hermits, these monks of the desert, and so forth, is that an isolated, hidden, unknown monk could draw people by the thousands. Why? How? People find holiness. This is what a starets is. It's a holy soul who attracts pilgrims like a magnet and opens his heart to all of their needs and leaves them better than he finds them. On the morning of January 2nd, 1833, one of the monks smelt something burning near Seraphim's cell. The monks broke down the door, They saw a small fire. They ran outside and grabbed some snow, and they put the fire out. In Seraphim's cell, some linen cloths and some books were burning. An oil lamp was burning. A prayer book was open with a service to the Mother of God, which he obviously had just prayed. Seraphim was on his knees before this icon of the Mother of God. His arms were crossed on his chest, and he was dead. 79 years old. He died like he lived, in prayer, in his cell, before the Mother of God. In 1903, he was glorified, or canonized, by the Russian Orthodox Church, and a religious procession escorted the relics on foot all the way from Moscow to the Divayevo Monastery of nuns, where he was the spiritual father. It was about 350 miles. Following the Bolshevik Revolution, Soviet authorities began to severely persecute religious groups, and as part of their persecution of Christians, they confiscated many relics of the saints, including the relics of Saint Seraphim. In 1923, the Sarov monastery was closed and the monks were executed by the Bolsheviks. During World War II, the monastery buildings were used as factories for producing rockets. In 1991, his relics were discovered in an atheism museum in Leningrad, where they had been hidden for over 70 years. And it is believed that they recognized these were the relics of Saint Seraphim because of that copper cross that his mother had given him. In 2016, the relics of Saint Seraphim were launched into space aboard the Russian spaceship Soyuz MS-02. And today, his relics are back at the Divayevo Monastery outside of Sarov. Here's a few comments and observations about his personality and character from those who knew him. In the act of canonization, this is what was said about him. Spiritual joy imbued the elder to such an extent that they never saw him sad or despondent. And this joyful state of his spirit he strove to impart also to others. Of the Christian virtues, he was most of all adorned with meekness, innocence, and extreme humility. Perhaps Seraphim's most famous quote is this: "Acquire a peaceful spirit, and thousands around you will be saved." He was particularly loved and popular with children. Adults knew that he never refused visits from children, and so adults would send their children into his hut in the forest and knock on his door because they knew that he wouldn't turn children away. One little girl described Saint Seraphim to her little friend like this: "Father Seraphim only looks like an old man, but he's really a child like us." A man came to Saint Seraphim desperate because his horse had been stolen. He fell at Seraphim's feet and cried out, "Without my horse, I am ruined." Seraphim said to him, "Keep quiet, go to the next village, take the road to the right, go behind the fence, you'll find your horse tethered to a post." The man did as Seraphim told him, and he retrieved his horse. What does that tell us? Nothing is too big or too small for the intercession of the saints. If it's important to us and for our good, for our welfare, for the things that we need, the saints will intercede and they will ask for those things that we need. There's another story told about another starets who a man approached him and said, "Why do you bother with this woman who keeps coming to you complaining about her turkeys? Why bother with this old woman and her turkeys?" And the Starets, in the same spirit of Saint Seraphim, we don't know who it was, the name wasn't given, but the Starets said to the man, because her whole life is in those turkeys. You see, this is the wisdom of Starets, of spiritual fathers. They know the things that are important to our lives, to our livelihood. They know what's important in our hearts. They know what we need. And nothing is too big or too small for them to help, to give succor, to give comfort, to intercede. There are numerous accounts of Saint Seraphim's wonder-working intercession, which included healings of all kinds. It's as if there was no limit to the help that he gave to suffering humanity. And so it is with all the saints. It's consoling to have the intercession of the saints in this way, being assured that they can and they will reach into our world and assist us with their prayers. The saints already ran the race. They already crossed the finish line. They've already heard the words, well done, good and faithful servant. Now enter into my Father's house. But they haven't left the thought of us behind. The saints don't dwell in eternal beatitude, completely oblivious to us on our pilgrim journey. They're aware of our hardships. They're aware that we are still running the race. And in a spirit of love and unity, they're devoted to helping us with their intercession. Before he died, Saint Seraphim made a promise to the nuns of the Divayevo monastery. But I believe in the magnanimous, charitable, loving spirit of Saint Seraphim. This promise would extend to us as well. He said, when I am dead, come to me at my grave, and the more often the better. Whatever is in your soul, whatever may have happened to you, come to me as when I was alive, and kneeling on the ground, cast all your bitterness upon my grave. Tell me everything, and I shall listen to you, and all the bitterness will fly away from you. And as you spoke to me when I was alive, do so now, for I am living, and I shall be forever. He made one other promise. He promised to intercede for those who would remember his parents, Isidore and Agafia. On this icon, I have draped two prayer ropes. One is a Greek prayer rope and one is a Russian lastovka. Western spirituality places a very important emphasis on the rosary, right? Eastern Christianity, however, has its own version of a rosary, so to speak, the prayer rope. In Greek, this is called a kamboskini. In Russian, it's called a chotki. And this particular prayer rope would have 33 either knots or beads made of wool, or 50 or 100 with a tassel. And sometimes you see them draped around someone's wrist and so forth. The main component of the prayer on the chotki, the Greek prayer rope, is the Jesus prayer. Eastern Christianity regards the prayer rope as the sword of the Spirit. It's a heartfelt and inspired prayer that defeats the devil. It has its origins in Christian monasticism. It's attributed all the way back to St. Pachomius the Great in the 4th century as an aid for illiterate monks to accomplish a consistent number of prayers and prostrations in their cells. During St. Seraphim's time and earlier, Russians prayed using the lastovka, which is also called a ladder rope. This too has the main component would be the Jesus prayer. However, instead of beads or knots, there are rungs that look like steps. And so that's where they get the name of the ladder rope. And there's a handout that I've given you that it kind of explains how the whole thing is crafted and the symbolism in all of the pieces, the parts of the listovka. During St. Seraphim's lifetime, the Greek prayer rope would eventually replace the listovka. And that's why in icons of St. Seraphim, you'll see him depicted with both. Sometimes he's depicted with the Greek prayer rope, and sometimes he's depicted with the listovka. And you'll notice the triangular shapes to the end of the rope. Today, Russian Old Believers still use the listovka prayer rope, but it's becoming more, there's becoming more interest even in that prayer, in both prayer ropes, as people discover the richness of these ways of praying. So this concludes part 1 of our retreat on St. Seraphim of Sarov, on the life and mission. In part 2, we're going to look at the transfiguration of St. Seraphim, when he was transfigured, where he radiated the uncreated light of Mount Tabor. We're going to look at the theology of the uncreated light and transfiguration. And then we're going to go on and talk about spirituality and theology of hesychasm and the Jesus prayer. And we're going to have some more reflections on some other things. And we will conclude our retreat. St. Seraphim of Sarov, pray for us. Glory to Jesus Christ. Okay, we're going to take about, let's take just about